Welcome to my presentation on the amazing benefits of vitamin D for COVID and immune health. The world is racing to develop a vaccine against COVID-19, something that many believe will put their fears around this virus to rest. The latest Gallup and Stat Harris polls suggest that at least half of Americans would get the vaccine if it were provided free of charge, even if it only cut their risk by under 25%. It's understandable that most Americans are willing to get a vaccine. They're scared and they want to protect themselves and their family from COVID. What doesn't make sense is that many of these same Americans are vitamin D deficient or insufficient. According to the Endocrine Society, a vitamin D status of less than 20 nanograms per milliliter or 50 nanomoles per liter is considered a deficiency. 20 to 30 nanograms or 50 to 75 nanomoles is an insufficiency, and more than 30 nanograms or 75 nanomoles is compatible with optimal health and considered sufficient. These recommendations line up well with the vitamin D concentrations of indigenous tribes in Africa: 25 to 68 nanograms per milliliter or 60 to 170 nanomoles per liter, with an average of 45 nanograms or 110 nanomoles. It's likely that these were the levels we evolved with and under which our immune system developed. Yet, 42% of Americans are vitamin D deficient, including 80% of the Black population and 70% of the Hispanic population. When we take into account vitamin D insufficiency, only 23% of the American population has sufficient vitamin D levels, including only 5% of Black Americans and 10% of Mexican Americans. While it's not really surprising considering that we transitioned from a people of the sun to a people of the cubicle, it is disheartening considering the essential role of vitamin D in protecting us from infectious diseases. In fact, I'd wager that if a simple vitamin D supplement were a vaccine, it'd be considered a miraculous breakthrough in COVID prevention and treatment. And my goal with this presentation is to show you why. Vitamin D fights infections in two fundamental ways. It enhances our immune defenses and bolsters the resilience of our tissues and organs. This means that vitamin D can help prevent us from becoming infected altogether, as well as reduce the severity of any infection that does take hold. For example, every immune cell in our body has vitamin D receptors in response to its signal, with the overarching effects being to suppress inflammation, promote immune tolerance, and maintain proper functionality of immune cells. A great example of this importance is T cells. T cells are a critically important aspect of our adaptive immune system. They are the cells that communicate with all other immune cells to coordinate attacks against invaders, as well as develop into a special type of cell that functions to eliminate very specific targets with minimal tissue damage, such as cancer cells or cells infected with viruses. These are called cytotoxic T cells. In the case of COVID, several studies have found that a more potent T cell response reduces the severity of the infection. There are more asymptomatic or mild cases in people who mount a more effective T cell response against COVID-19. And guess what T cells require in order to mobilize? Vitamin D. Adequate vitamin D is critically important for the activation of T cells from their inactive state. As another example, consider the antimicrobial peptide cathelicidin, which is produced by innate immune cells and respiratory epithelial cells in response to infections by bacteria, viruses, and fungi. It functions to both directly kill invading pathogens and also neutralize any endotoxins they might release. Yet this powerfully protective compound requires vitamin D to be produced. And lastly, high levels of vitamin D are critical for first-line immune defenses, including physical mucosal defenses, tight junctions, gap junctions, and adherens junctions, all of which are disturbed by viral and bacterial infections as part of their efforts to establish a stronghold within the body. Without adequate vitamin D circulating throughout the body, our innate and adaptive immune defenses are sabotaged against bacterial and viral assaults. In other words, and quite simply, vitamin D deficiency and insufficiency predisposes us to infections. So, the biological plausibility is there. The mechanistic rationale for vitamin D in preventing and treating infections doesn't just exist, it's incredibly strong. But even so, theory must take a backseat to experimental investigations. As the renowned physicist Richard Feynman once said, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, It doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. Thankfully, there have been numerous investigations looking at the effect of vitamin D supplementation on the risk of experiencing respiratory tract infections. The most recent, largest, and well-conducted meta-analysis pooled data from 25 randomized controlled trials with nearly 11,000 participants living on 15 different countries on 4 continents. Yeah, it's big. Vitamin D supplementation was found to reduce the risk of acute respiratory infections by 12%. That means that only 33 individuals would have required supplemental vitamin D to prevent just one of them from suffering a respiratory infection. And the benefits were most pronounced with daily or weekly dosing, as opposed to taking huge monthly boluses that were not significantly protective. When using the smaller and more frequent dosing regimen, supplementation reduced the risk of respiratory infections by 25 to 75%, depending on how deficient a person was before supplementing. And if you do happen to become infected, vitamin D can help prevent more severe complications. For example, one study followed over 9,500 older adults for 15 years and found that the risk of dying from respiratory infections increased substantially as vitamin D status dropped below 30 nanograms per milliliter, or 75 nanomoles per liter. Just having a vitamin D status of 20 nanograms or 50 nanomoles doubled the risk of death compared to having it at 30 nanograms or 75 nanomoles. And these observations are largely upheld when it comes to COVID specifically. As you're about to see, the totality of evidence supports obtaining sufficient vitamin D status as a means of preventing and reducing the severity of COVID-19. First and foremost, we all become sick every now and again, no matter the illness. The goal is to make it as bearable and harmless as possible, and vitamin D can help make that a reality. Published online in June of 2020, researchers from France, Canada, and China determined that vitamin D status is a biological determinant of COVID-19 outcomes using the Bradford-Hill criteria for causality. This criteria is used when there is a lack of interventions for determining whether a causal relationship exists between two variables. This can be incredibly helpful when it would be unethical to expose people to certain variables like cigarette smoke, which is where the Bradford-Hill criteria made its debut, showing that smoking causes lung cancer. Basically, since it would be unethical to expose people to COVID-19, the researchers used the available mechanistic and observational evidence to show that a causal link is likely between vitamin D status and COVID-19 outcomes, whereby deficiency increased the susceptibility to infection and the severity of infectious outcomes. For example, adults admitted to a Spanish hospital for COVID had better lung function, lower medication requirements, lower ICU admissions, and a shorter hospital stay if their vitamin D status was above 20 nanograms per milliliter, or 50 nanomoles per liter. In other studies, vitamin D deficiency has been associated with a 2 to 3-fold greater risk of having more severe COVID outcomes and a 6-fold greater risk of requiring invasive mechanical ventilation or death, even after adjusting for important confounders like age, sex, and the presence of comorbidities. Now, 2 months after the Bradford-Hill criteria were satisfied for vitamin D in COVID, supportive experimental evidence finally emerged. It was a relatively simple study in which researchers from Spain randomly allocated adults showing up at their hospital with a COVID infection to receive standard medical care with or without supplemental vitamin D. And that was it. That was how ridiculously simple the study was. All the patients received standard medical care, but 50 received vitamin D while 26 did not. And guess what happened? In the placebo group of 26 patients, half were admitted to the ICU, and 2 of those patients died. Yet, in the group of 50 patients receiving vitamin D, only 1 was admitted to the ICU and none died. In other words, simply adding vitamin D to the standard of care for COVID reduced the odds of requiring ICU admission by 97%. And these findings make sense. COVID-19 is a respiratory virus that infiltrates cells of the lungs and causes an exacerbated inflammatory response, leading to impaired breathing ability and severe pneumonia. This is what can kill you in a severe infection. However, this intense inflammatory response, also called a cytokine storm, is likely inhibited by vitamin D, a conclusion supported by previous research in rodents showing that vitamin D reduces markers of both lung inflammation and lung damage following drug-induced injury. All in all, one of the best things you can do for your health is ensure an adequate vitamin D status. If you happen to catch COVID while your vitamin D is low, then it's probably a good idea to start supplementing right away. And what's cool about ensuring optimal vitamin D levels year round is that it will likely reduce the risk of catching COVID to begin with, which makes all the previous information somewhat moot. For example, a study of over 190,000 adults living in all 50 US states found a clear inverse relationship between COVID prevalence and vitamin D status, with a plateau occurring at around 55 nanograms per milliliter, or 135 nanomoles per liter. Roughly every 1 nanogram per milliliter increase, or 2.5 nanomole per liter increase in vitamin D status was associated with a 2% reduction in the likelihood of being infected. Other smaller studies have confirmed this association, whereby people who test positive for COVID-19 tend to have lower vitamin D levels on average. Interestingly enough, a study of 34 countries on every continent found that COVID-19 cases are more common in areas of the world where there is less UVB exposure, which is necessary for vitamin D production in the skin. Imagine the media frenzy that would occur following the announcement of a vaccine with an efficacy similar to vitamin D. I'm not sure it's possible to conjure up that level of excitement, but the analogy is crystal. Vitamin D may as well be a medical breakthrough for COVID-19. We have a plethora of high-quality data showing that maintaining optimal vitamin D levels reduces the risk and severity of respiratory tract infections, and emerging data is beginning to show the exact same thing with COVID. Moreover, we have a plethora of data showing how vitamin D accomplishes such feats through enhancing immune function, improving mucosal barrier integrity, and controlling inflammation. Yet 42% of Americans are deficient, with many more insufficient. If you are social distancing, wearing a mask, and taking other precautions to not catch COVID-19, but you aren't supplementing with vitamin D or ensuring regular sun exposure, then I'm sorry to say that you have your priorities backwards. This isn't to say that those things aren't important, only that vitamin D supplementation and regular sun exposure should be on the list with them. And that's it, everyone. That's the reason I think ensuring you have sufficient vitamin D levels is one of the most important things you can do to battle COVID-19. Please make an effort to spend some time in the sun or supplement vitamin D. Ensuring your vitamin D levels are optimal can help reduce the risk of infection and the severity of any infection you do catch. And please also take some time to share this video and help make the role of vitamin D in COVID-19 prevention and treatment go viral. Pun 100% intended. If you enjoyed this video, then please do not forget to give it a like and also to subscribe to our YouTube channel.